I'm Michele Gerber Klein, and I'm interviewing Couri Hay, who is the expert on Charles James.
No, I don't know about being the expert on Charles James.
Well, you're the person who instigated these tapes that started the project that
That's
we're all
true.
working on.
That's true, and it's kind of an interesting moment because not only was I the person that interviewed Charles James during this period, but of course Anton Perich, who is behind the camera where he belongs, out of sight, out of sound, which he'll certainly do to me in a minute. But it's kind of like a reunion, really, in a way. It's almost like Charles is sitting in that chair over there because here we are once again, Anton and I, doing this documentary on Charles. Only in this case, of course, Charles is very dead. But, he lives on through, his dresses and through the couture he created and the art. And we have some of that.
You made.
And the tapes that we made.
Right.
I guess we're going to sort of like fluff these tapes up, so to speak, sort of give them a new perspective.
Well, no, I was talking to Anton about that, and there's shows that have been done with this sort of in the time period and retrospective feeling to them, and they're always very interesting because you see what the thing was like then.
That's hopeful.
And then you see how you see it,
as we look back.
20 years later, as we look back. And so it's, we have precedent for this, and it's a good way to approach it.
And of course, you're writing a book.
Well, yes.
So you're going to end up being the resident expert, I think, on Charles James. And
well,
I know
your eyes.
Through my eyes.
And the eyes of the people who knew him.
Exactly.
Right.
And including, I guess, Homer Lane, of course, his trusted assistant.
Right, his trusty assistant. Right.
And who else have you talked to?
Elizabeth de Cuevas.
Right. Who was a great friend and a great benefactor of Charles's. Mm-hmm. And towards the end of his life, it was Elizabeth de Cuevas and Elsa Peretti and I who really kind of helped keep him on his feet and support him. And of course, Bessie, the sculptor, he was still making clothes for Bessie right up till the day he died.
She claims he didn't really make clothes for her.
Well, there was a figure
Except they
formed.
pinned that famous bra on her that you have in your tape.
Well, he always said he was making things for her.
Well, he probably
but
was.
Charles was.
He may not have
finished
them.
Yes, well, Charles was famous for starting ball gowns and outfits and then never finishing them, or famously ripping them up in front of the client at the last minute as she was due to go to the ball. Charles would come in and deliver this wonderful work of art, which his couture really was. And then she'd get all excited, and suddenly she'd say the wrong thing, or he didn't like the way something fit, and he would just rip it off her, and she'd dissolve in tears and wear Balenciaga or something else. He was famous for this sort of eccentric behavior.
I don't know if it's really that eccentric, but in a way...
Trust me, I knew him. He was eccentric.
Well, people were afraid of him. I mean, Harold Corda, when he walked into the Met, was told, "Hi, Charles James is here." So he feels terrible about it now because he never got to
very
meet Charles
outspoken,
James.
And he was very clear about what he wanted and how he wanted to do things, and I think that made him slightly unpredictable. So if you angered him, said the wrong thing, Charles just might put you in your place or tell you what he really thought. Right. So Charles did away with some of the diplomacy of dealing with people. So he would, probably tell Diana Vreeland off. And of course,
he hated Diana.
Well, I'd say he wasn't fond of her.
Let's start at the beginning, Couri. Let's start with this Electric Circus show, that's how you met him.
Yes.
And you were a baby.
And
Halston was in love with you.
Oh my God.
And Halston asked you to be the junior chair of this show that he was giving as a retrospective to Charles James to sort of link his name with Charles's legend, I guess. And also because
Let me color this a little differently.
Okay, all right.
I was a friend of Halston's and a good friend, and I was a teenager. I was actually still just emerging out of prep school. And I had been coming down to New York, and I'd met Halston when my grandmother and I were getting Panama hats. And we formed a friendship. And yes, he liked me, and I liked him too. And he wanted me to bring young people to this Electric Circus show. Now, the Electric Circus at the time was a very famous place in New York. It was a discotheque.
Yeah, it was
and
huge.
yeah, it was hot. And And he started to educate me about this man named Charles James, who had been a mentor of his.
But you knew him because didn't he make your grandmother hats too?
He
Or
did.
your grandmother bought hats.
Bought hats. He bought hats, but I hadn't been trailing around at this time to do this.
Right.
But that's how I got actually to Halston too, because my mother and grandmother both loved hats, and so this kind of brought me into the hat thing. And actually, Charles had made some coats for my grandmother as well. But I hadn't had that relationship with him until really Halston kind of cemented it, put it all together.
Right.
And in fact, well, Charles had also done some things for Betsy Whitney and some of my other cousins, and he was a famous couturier, and all the ladies had gone to
there
Charles
isn't
James.
a lady of a certain period that does not now claim or who doesn't have relatives that claim that she had something by Charles James. I mean, he
Well,
was
you could have had something by Charles James all across America. I mean, Charles did those Modest ads, and he was doing, clothes that were being mass produced.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was
So
the
I mean,
first person
he
to do
wanted to
that.
dress America. In fact, he was one of the first designers, I think, that really wanted to make the perfect coat and the perfect dress. He wanted to dress all of America. So there I was, and sort of like spinning off these different relationships that suddenly brought me face to face with Charles James.
do you remember the first thing you thought when you saw him?
Well, the first thing I thought was he was older,
Right.
and he seemed very wise. He seemed to really know what he was doing and what he was saying, and he had a really captivating personality. He was charming, but there was definitely eccentric. I mean, when you go down to the Chelsea Hotel, and I hope we can go back down there, Anton, and go back, maybe even get Mr. Bard to let us into those actual rooms,
I would love
which I'm
that.
sure are going to look entirely different. But when you entered kind of into this Charles James world, it was quite amazing. So, and it was Halston who said, I want you to be the junior chairman of this event, because as they do now, people want young people involved in benefits and cultural affairs, and this is the sort of tradition that we've seen follow through. And now I want young people to be involved in some of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it was Halston. In fact, this giant penis over here was one of the pieces that were made around the Electric Circus show. And there's a
hung his
marvelous
art
piece
there.
downstairs with whips and bare buttocks. Charles had a love of erotica. So when I'm dealing with Halston, I'm seeing these crazy kind of erotic drawings which are sparking my interest because I'm a kid from Maine, and I'm a New
Never
England
seen
boy, I'm a
anything like
Yankee,
that.
and
Right,
it's
yeah.
just a little unusual.
Right.
And Halston, of course, was also a character bigger than life and quite unusual. So I was going from Halston
What stage
to
was
Charles, and I'm
Halston-
hearing these stories from my grandmother and different other family members and people.
you're
and so
fascinated.
I'm actually fascinated and ready to meet
Right.
Charles James, the legend. He was a legend then. He was already a legend.
He was a living legend.
He was a living legend.
And what stage in his career was Halston at?
Halston was.
Was he at Bergdorf's yet?
He had been a Bergdorf's, but he now
He'd
had his
left
own
Berg- okay.
studio and his own atelier on Madison Avenue.
Financed
Very
by-
famous one. He had financed it. I mean, Angelo Donghi had decorated the third floor, basically of a brownstone, which I think is now Hermes or something.
Okay.
And it was a wonderful, mysterious room, all sort of draped in Indian fabric and tinted, and there were these huge ivory tusks and furniture made of ivory tusks or elephant tusks or animal tusks, animal furniture and
African
hides,
style,
and it was quite interesting. And always, Halston had these Charles James drawings, a few of them sort of like leaned against the desk, and if you look up here, you can see, and Anton will get to them eventually, some of the drawings, as I, in the end, bought all the drawings I could from Charles to help finance Charles's life. So with all this background going on and the mystery and the excitement, I actually went and met Charles. And the Chelsea Hotel, number one, is already,
You
it's
met
still,
him in the Chelsea
Yes.
Hotel. So, and it was a little run down.
It's a little run down, but it's also a
little
legendary
seedy, and
place.
it's sort of exciting. It's mysterious and glamorous.
And you had famous writers there.
Oh,
and
huge from everywhere. Yeah. You want me to say some of the famous writers?
If you've
I'm
got them
trying
at
to
the tip of your
think.
tongue, but also Lou Reed was there. There were rock and roll figures. I mean, this is where Sid
Vicious stabbed his wife and committed suicide.
The place was like,
yes,
it was like
yes,
exciting. It was exciting, and it was a little. Richard Bernstein was there. It's been a place for artists, famous writers for a long
Mark
time.
Twain stayed there.
Very
it's coming
famous
to me,
place.
Way back.
So you think of all these elements that are combining. First, I'm uptown with Halston and all the glamour and the
Very
high
seductive.
society women, and then you go down to sort of an opposite end of the spectrum where you're going to this kind of seedy, raunchy hotel where people have been murdered and died of overdoses, and it's about sex, it's about drugs, it's about rock and roll, and I'm going in there and I'm like, I'm like in a pale, lemon yellow suit or something, literally, and I'm going in and I'm going up this elevator and I'm finally come to this door, and it's wood, and there's these huge halls, and I knock rather
Timidly.
Very timidly. And then all of a sudden this door opens. And first of all, a dog jumps out, Sputnik. And his Sputnik is like barking. And I was like, I should have run right then, And then behind them is this little man.
Was he little?
He was little. Charles was little. Anton, how tall was Charles? 5'8"?
No, he wasn't that little.
He wasn't tall. Halston was tall. Halston was like 6'2", 6'3". And no, Charles was little, 5'10", tops.
In that
tops,
picture
Charles
you have,
did.
Anton, he's wearing these high heels. Do you remember that?
He's wearing little elevated boots. He's not in, Milanos.
I give him.
He's not in stilettos, but they're not stilettos.
No, but
he's
they're
not
high
in drag.
heels. No, but
although,
they're high
he
heels.
was famous for often trying on his own clothes.
Yes, you
Or
told
picking
me.
up boys on the street and having them try on the clothes.
Well,
so he's,
but that has to do with the kind of.
Well,
if
they're
good
still
clothes,
doing that in
everybody
Paris,
can
of
wear
course,
them. Yes. Well,
trying
they
them
did
on and
that.
putting them on boys. But I mean, so there I am, and then there's Charles, and it's just taking the whole thing in, because behind Charles is this kind of enormous square room, and his bed is coming out at an angle in one part, and behind him are these white paper flowers made to look like roses. There are
Did he make
dress
them?
forms, yes. There are dress forms with half dresses on them, and then there are little minions running around. There's little blonde. What was his name? That one that used to steal all Charles's change all the time. Blair, And then there was Homer, sort of like timid, really timid, and hovering and frightened, and they're all rather hovering and frightened. And Charles and I meet,
Right.
and we just.
Hit it up.
My curiosity was so, aroused that I went in and we started having this conversation and, talking about my grandmother and talking about, I love fashion, of course, and I loved the whole idea of this world of glamour that Charles James represented, because I came in with all these stories. Of him dressing
Legends,
Marlene
right,
Dietrich and
right.
Mae West and Mrs. William Randolph Hearst and Mrs. Babe Paley and Harrison, Mrs. The most famous of them all. We really have to have notes to remember all this stuff, because these women are all gone,
Right.
of course. And so I knew
Hearst.
Austin Hearst. And but who's the one with the H that we really have to remember? We have to do our homework. We haven't done it all. We really haven't. We need a lot of notes. Uh-oh. Let me turn this off. Magic of technology. We can turn it off. So, and Charles and I started these conversations. And Anton, do you remember when I first brought you into this picture? I mean, my relationship, with Halston and with Charles was going on simultaneously.
Right.
And there's so many stories here. This will be 8 hours. We'll have to really do this in sections. At some point of the story, because there's the whole electric circus story, and
Well, I wanted to hear that.
I don't know if we can put this all. You want to hear that story?
Yes.
All right. So I'm shuttling back and forth between Halston and Charles, and they are already, of course,
At
war.
loggerheads,
At
right,
war.
okay.
I mean, they're at war. Halston, wanted it done this way, and he had Verushka and Angelica Houston, and brought all the top models of the day and the top figures. And Verushka didn't want to wear shoes, and Angelica wanted to crawl across the floor, and nobody wanted, Charles to go down and really fit the models or choose the dresses.
He's going to rip them off.
Very complicated.
Right, yeah.
I remember there was a party that was being given by Mrs. William F. Buckley, who was the great reigning society doyenne of her day. Yeah, very much around. But she was really ruling the roost.
Right.
She was ruling the city. She was running, all the top charities. She was like, ran the great salon.
Right.
And she was giving a party, and she also was a client of Halston's. She was giving a party the night before the electric circuits, kind of the kickoff, as I remember it.
Right, the pre-party.
And Charles decided he wouldn't go because he was so angry with the way that Halston was organizing this entire thing, and he felt, I think, out of control. He felt he had lost control of the show.
Right.
It was becoming a Halston production
Which
with
it
Charles,
was,
which it was, with Charles as kind of like the star, but they were kind of like trying to push Charles away and not let him really control it. And he felt that. Well, okay, in a way, I think that might be true.
And also, but you could not let Charles near the clothes because if he didn't like them, he was going to rip them up. So there was that.
Well, they were his clothes, so he wasn't going to rip them up too much. It was more about who was going to wear what and how they were going to come out, how it was going to be presented. There were more of these elements. But, in
the end,
Charles was no fool.
Right.
And so he showed up at Mrs. Buckley's at the last minute, and came in and made a big appearance, and the party went on. It was quite a nice party, and yes, the show was fabulous. I mean, you've got Verushka coming out in these Charles James dresses. You have these wonderful models.
Right.
Halston was, he was it. He was the it boy. He was the designer of the moment, and all the most famous ladies, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and Mrs. Buckley and Nan Kempner and Betsy Kaiser and Lily Auchincloss, and everybody went.
The girls.
To Dee Dee Ryan, all the ladies. They weren't girls, they were ladies.
Right.
Went to Halston, and because
they came to the show
of the allure of Charles James, who everybody knew, just the way I had heard these stories, they had more lived through the era of the Modeste ads and him dressing Austin Hurst and creating these marvelous.
1952, I think, 3.
So you're the expert.
Right. Okay.
I know the general picture. You've got all the dates and the times.
Personal picture.
Thank God for Michele Gerber Klein. So I remember that the show was a huge success. I mean, it was a sensation. Number one, Charles's clothes live and walk like other people's clothes don't.
That's true.
As Mrs. Hurst said, and as Charles showed me in the famous black and white dress, which is up there in the corner, Anton, when you got there, they would photograph the dress, and the dress hinged on a woman's hips and moved back and forth.
Right.
And if you play back the videotape of Mrs. Hurst walking in this, I think the Red Cross ball or something at the Waldorf in this dress, it moved as beautifully backwards as it did go forwards in terms if you turn the tape around.
So it was a perfect architectural
architectural hinge.
Right.
And became this big, very heavy bottom of the dress, became virtually weightless by its architectural,
sleight of hand, right.
The way he hinged it, so to speak, on the woman. He really knew how to cut, he knew how to fit, and he thought about things about how it would react when it was moving.
Well, I think that was his whole world, to create these perfect designs.
Well, they were the first soft sculptures. Yeah. Salvador Dali called them soft sculptures. And of course, when you go that way, Anton, you'll see the white satin quilted jacket, which became the Parker. Charles James really kind of invented the Parker. It's up there on the left. I can see, even by what we're doing now, how we probably did make 52 hours. Because, we're talking about Charles, but you imagine talking to Charles. Charles was the repository of all these amazing stories. So he's now, what is Charles, 65 when we're doing this?
No, he was in his 70s, and
He's
you
in his
were
70s,
doing it
okay.
when he died.
Time
it was
is-
the last project that.
Oh,
that
I
he
just
was
hate
really
to think of
involved
it
in.
like that. Well, he was a pretty active guy. If he was
He was
dying,
incredibly
he was
active, and
outgoing.
he-
He was out going to sex clubs and like nourishing
every
people.
night.
Not every night, but no. But I remember when Egon von Furstenberg and Andy Warhol and I and Charles went down to the
so you
opening
knew
of.
Andy.
Oh, of course.
Okay. And
I
went
mean,
down to the
everybody
opening
knew
of what,
everybody
the Anton
to
or
some
something?
degree. Yeah, and Charles disappeared into a back room, and when he came out, I said, "Charles, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I was nourishing someone." I said, "Okay, Charles," and I took him to the opening of Studio 54, where he came in this marvelous sombrero, and nobody knew who he was. But there, on the next day in the New York Daily News, there was a huge picture of Charles James at the opening. No name, but his panache,
Right.
his charisma, his
was so
persona
cool.
was so strong that they photographed him. And you're telling me he was in his 70s. Okay, to me, everyone's always in their 20s. But
What a wonderful world you live in.
he still had exactly, and he still just had it. He had it, whether you knew who he was or not. When Charles James walked into a room, you knew someone important had walked in. He had the weight of history, of importance on him. You knew. And when he spoke, and that was it from that first knock on that door, when Charles James opened that door, I knew I was in the presence of genius. And I knew that I had something to learn.
Right.
And I knew that he had something to teach me and to
Yes.
show me. And this was the kind of the basis of our relationship. I knew that he was my teacher,
What
and
do you
I knew
think
that
you
I was
learned
the
from
student.
Charles James?
I learned about storyboards, which we haven't made for here. Charles taught me the importance of a storyboard, and I still haven't learned or applied all the lessons that Charles taught me.
But what's
But
the
a
real
storyboard
lesson
is
that
when
he
you take
taught
a
you?
board. Well, storyboard. You take the board, you put it on the wall, and you take index cards and you write the building blocks of your story. Like I should be writing who lived at the Chelsea Hotel and what
Right.
year, and how old was Charles when I first met him, and what was he wearing, and then
Oh,
you
the facts.
move these cards around on your storyboard until you get the perfect order, and then you tell the story. Charles would kill me if he thought I was doing this improvisationally like I'm doing, trying to remember it on the cuff. He would hate this. He would have turned the camera off or thrown it out the window. He would not approve of this. Charles taught me that
But
you
you
should
can't
always
help
know
yourself, honey.
Charles, when I interviewed Charles for Interview, because I was an editor of Interview at the time, one of the founding editors, Charles, of course, wrote the questions. But before he wrote the questions, he wrote the answers.
Right. Oh, he wrote
And
the
so I
answers,
had
and then he
barely
wrote the
anything to
questions.
do with this.
That's okay.
I was barely allowed to, and I remember when we were running late, Charles ripped the story in half because he wasn't happy with every little sentence, and he thought that I was, superficial and not being serious about
Well,
it.
you were
And here
young.
I am still being superficial and not serious enough for Charles James. He was a very serious man. And okay, this maybe, don't think that I knew Charles for at least 10 years. That had to be 10 years. It seemed like it. Again, no storyboard, no facts. So it was a long period of time that I knew Charles. I knew him when I was close with Halston. I knew him when I, basically dumped Halston because he had treated Charles so callously while we were in Greece, when he closed Charles James's work. So there are so many stories here. This is going to have to be another 52-hour series on Charles James.
No, you know
because I'm going to have to
what? We're gonna
remember
make-
the whole thing all over. I remember when
there.
he was filming Charles. Charles, of course, was aware of the camera, and he would take an elastic and put it under his chin and over. I would just show you. I'm not quite ready for the elastic yet. I'm not ready for that trick quite yet. But he would put an elastic on, and then he would take shoe polish and put it on his hair. I'm talking shoe polish. And that's how he would prepare.
He didn't have the money for a makeup
He would
person.
prepare.
He made his own. He made his own.
We should be able to get him a free one. Where are all the queers? Where are all the hairdressers? I can't believe we couldn't get a free hairdresser for Charles James. But Charles, that's how he would prepare, and he would, put on his elastic and
Right.
take his shoe polish out, and he was ready to go on.
Right.
And then, I learned to basically, as Charles did, basically to ignore the camera, to some degree, although
Right,
it's
yeah.
frightening to do that with Mr. Parrish behind the film.
He's all right.
And we just would let the film go, and we would talk. And I would interview him. Then I started bringing other people in. I brought my fiancée at the time, Zonda Rhodes, in. I went from Halston to Zonda Rhodes. I know, I'm ill, very ill. And I was actually...
she's cute. I mean, she was adorable.
She was adorable, yeah. I had varied interests. And
Why should you
she
do
would,
well?
and I still do. And Zonda would, he would take out the clothes. He had all these fabulous clothes. Don't forget, see, this is a long period of time. It's naughty of me that I don't have it buttoned down yet, but we'll do that.
Okay.
But I was at Georgetown. I was in school in Washington, and I would be sent to O.T. Charles to pick up these marvelous coats and dresses, and these ladies would bring these marvelous things out in these beautiful big boxes, all wrapped in tissue paper, and it all been saved, and you'd open the box, and they would take out the tissue paper. It was like a ceremony, like you were in Japan, bringing out one of those great, tea outfits or whatever they call them, geisha gear, and out would come these beautiful lemon yellow satin jackets that were lined in sky blue pale silk inside. Right. They had these most marvelous sleeves and these marvelous. And I'm not a fashion student. Don't forget, I was studying politics. I wanted to be president. But I was totally dazzled, totally charmed.
Right, yeah.
It's true that my grandmother was quite a dresser. She loved clothes. She loved hats. So I had been trained to appreciate beauty. Right. Of course I did. And she loved Charles James. She also liked Adolfo. She also liked Adolfo. She liked her hats too. Yeah, but she liked Adolfo's hats too.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, ladies that dress, wore more than one designer. Although at his height, Charles always said, "I only dressed 10 women." There's only 10 women in the world that could afford it financially and emotionally, and the physical abuse or emotional abuse that Charles reportedly put everyone through. But everybody put up with Charles James because he was a genius, and you knew it, you felt it, you heard it, you saw it. And I guess I never wore the clothes, I will confess. Although
you
he
never?
did, well,
yes,
he wore,
you did. You wore that cape.
The cape, and he made some pants for me and a shirt. I never wore the girls' clothes. I never wore the girls' clothes.
Well, the cape women could wear that cape. It's an absolutely beautiful cape. I mean, it's a cape.
I don't want to disappoint all of you. I
history.
did not go in drag during this period. Now, I just never had the figure for it. I probably should have. I was a fool. I should have been in. I could sit here and talk about being dressed in couture by Charles James. I mean, how many people can say that? Probably. But Charles put them on. Charles would model them for me on occasion.
Because he needed to see how they felt on the body, and he was very.
He
was like a very hands-on
and how
designer.
How they moved,
how you could play with them.
But we also, Anton and I would bring in models of the moment and some fabulous girls who would, and Charles was very modern. I mean, this wasn't all stuffy ball gowns and all very covered up. Charles believed that there was a point of sexual tension in every dress, and that a lady and couture he said that couture was about giving a figure that a lady, the figure she wanted but didn't necessarily have.
Well, I think the figure that he perceived would make her most beautiful.
Exactly.
That she might not.
And he always said there was a point of sexual tension somewhere in the dress, and that you had to know where that line was and not cross it into, tartiness. And of course, he expressed himself a lot better than I do. And Charles had a wonderful mastery of words.
Right.
And he was very, very articulate. He was extremely well read. You could have seen the reading list. Charles James gave me like 18 pages of I would still be reading. I would still be reading. Well, who knows where they are? Although I've kept every scrap of paper.
No,
but
it's
I don't know where it is.
interesting to see what he thought was very important.
I can still tell you that his favorite cologne was Abbey Rouge, and I wear it to this day.
There you go. He taught you that.
He taught me that. And he taught me, once he told me, and of course, I'm not sure if the audience knows, but I'm a gossip columnist in many parts of my life. They may not know that. And Charles always said, forget the gossip columns. It's biographies that you need to be a part of.
Well, you wanted
Say
to be
yes to
greatness.
biographies.
It was
Forget
greatness.
about the columns. There was
Right.
already that war in my life, columns in art, columns in biographies. It was
But they're
always
not
the
mutually
fight of
exclusive,
gossip against
Couri.
biographical, information.
What do you think Proust is, if not a bunch
I
of
think
gossip?
it's all a bunch of gossip.
It is.
And I think that
I mean,
Charles,
it's
if he
great
lived
gossip,
on,
but-
would have included the internet and included, artistic endeavors like this, and the film that Anton made. These really have preserved so much better than I can talk about it, the legend of Charles James, and that's what you're really going to get to see. You're going to get to see sometime, depending on Anton's editing, Charles James himself. Charles talking, Charles bitching, Charles complaining, Charles praising, Charles charming, Charles being all these different ways, and with me, kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing, but at alternate times he
You're
loved
good,
me
though.
and was furious at me, and it's a very
sort of
revealing
spits at
series
you. Yeah.
of, well, not literally, let's
Well, he does
let's
kind
not
of-
let them.
He hisses
kind of,
a
what
little
kind of
bit,
film is
and
this?
He gets his back up, right?
Well, I would infuriate him,
You
and
did.
sometimes quite deliberately. And he would do the same back to me. We had a very playful relationship. I was a very willful, strong young man. So I didn't, I would fight him back. He became kind of like my mother. He was a little, he was a little combative.
Right.
But so we had a playful relationship, and yet we loved each other. And although it was never physical, in any way, it was definitely strongly emotional. And but somehow I figured out that Charles James was important, and that what Charles said was important. So I dragged Anton Perich down. It was, always filming boobs and tits and ass. And, he forget
can
my
tell
shirt being unbuttoned. He specialized in finding every blouse unbuttoned. And Max's Kansas City, we were filming, like going home at night, and Taylor Mead putting light bulbs up people's rectums. And if we did a fashion show, it was like, Angelica Houston's top falling off backstage at Austin. He was really overwhelmed with tits and ass. And I was overwhelmed with Charles James. And somehow Anton as well, figured out that Charles is important, because hour after hour, day after day, month after month, we went back. And he would go back. So, you see, Charles, you just knew it. Again, you were in the presence of genius. There was something to learn. He had something to say, and we realized it was important. And that's why we made these tapes, which we're going to share with you, and hope to share with students and with people who love couture and love fashion and who love life. And because in the end, Charles stood for life. Because even into his 70s, up till the day he died, he was working. They found him dead on the floor 2 or 3 days later. He had obviously alienated everyone around him at this point. I was probably in Europe. And Charles always said to me, and when it comes to the summer, I'd go off to Europe for 3 months. He goes, stay. If you stay, you'll be so much further ahead than everyone that goes away.
Oh, because you
Charles
have time
was
to work.
talk
right.
about working and discipline and dedication. These are the things that Charles taught me. And how to
his
be very
vision.
a little eccentric and a little bitchy. I learned that from Charles James too. I could be difficult. So he was a wealth of information. And I, of course, got to meet his children.
Right.
And, we had late nights together going out to eat. And
Well, you'd feed him too.
and
He didn't have any food. You'd buy him clothes.
Well,
I mean,
Charles was...
he was destitute, sort of.
Well, he wasn't exactly destitute. He was still living in the Chelsea.
Right, but he was
In
not
the beginning, he
rich.
had 3. No, he was not rich. But
At
there
all.
were 3 large rooms. He had,
wasn't
God
paying his
knows
rent.
what that room must rent for today. It must be like $6,000 a month. It was a major studio. And then he had quite a big workroom until Mr. Bard, the wicked one, took it away for non-payment of rent. I don't know what he was
Well, he
upset
didn't
about.
pay
He just
his
hadn't
rent.
paid for 10 years, maybe
Right,
12. And then there was
He had
a
a
little,
sense of
there was a little
entitlement.
in between the 2 rooms. There was this marvelous little narrow room, which was where was the library, which had all the scrapbooks. That's what Charles taught me. Never take something out of the scrapbook. Never take it out of the press books. And he was right. Every time you take it out, you lose it. And every time I've taken things out of mine, I've lost them. So when I think back on the lessons that Charles taught me, they're still coming back to me. And I'm Charles, I'm sorry, I've failed completely. I still haven't applied these lessons, but I'm
You're
still working
applying
on it.
them now.
I'm still younger than you were, and so I'm still working on it.
You're applying them now. You're getting yourself in a book, right?
That's right, I guess so. And
So
Charles would love
those
this.
who-
That's why we're doing it. Charles would. I'm doing it for him as much as
Right,
for
yeah.
the world, for you.
And an
Yeah.
art show.
And
We're
an art
doing
show.
something
That's right.
intellectual.
We're
as
trying.
well.
But isn't it amazing
trying
that,
is
that
not-
back when I was like 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, that 23, 24, that I actually somehow accidentally stumbled into this, and that we did it, and that we saved
Well,
it,
it's
we still have it,
interesting to
and
me-
now we're going to turn it into something new.
Right.
And
But it's
why?
interesting to
Why
me
is
that
it interesting?
You did it. Well, it's interesting to me that you did it.
I still haven't
from
figured out
love.
why you're doing this exactly, but
Well, I think
or I'm giving you
there-
a chance to articulate it.
No, I think there are a lot of elements that are fascinating in this. One of this is this interplay between this young man who is you meeting this older man and being kind of bewitched by him and wanting to learn about him even though you're very different people, and wanting to make this kind of homage to him. Even though you're very different people. The other thing is the personality of Charles James himself, which I see as a man who really created from inside himself, as opposed to taking things around him as they were and rearranging them. We were having this conversation about the other night in terms of jewelry. I mean, there's a jeweler called Jar, and somebody said to me, do you think Jar is a great jeweler because he's sort of the jeweler of the moment? And I said, well, no, you know, what he does is he finds a piece and he kind of tweaks it, he perfects it. But there are people who take the stone and make it into something, you know, that's a drawing.
Well, Charlie
Or
is
there are
very
people
clever.
who will make a drawing and find the stone to fit it, you know. But Charles existed on so many levels in his mind. I mean, he
Charles
really
didn't
was.
steal the ideas; he created them.
No, they came
Charles
from
wasn't a
him.
stylist. He wasn't an interpreter. You know, Halston and I would go to Paris. He'd send me into Yves Saint Laurent to buy the collection, and I would do this quite innocently. I thought he was shopping for me. I thought, you know, nice. Then he said, well, no, I'm going to send this to Japan. I'm going to move a button here and change this a little bit
Yeah, he
and
tweaked
make
it.
it my own.
He tweaked it.
And
Yeah.
stole it. And
Okay,
this is
wow.
when I started to lose my respect for Halston, and when I realized that the genius of Charles James.
You
Charles
love
James
that.
was a creator.
And a teacher. He was a
and
giver.
He wasn't going to Paris as so many of his, you know, dreaded Seventh Avenue names would go and just copy Paris or tweak Paris or style Paris
Right.
or
Uh-huh.
it was a whole different way of life, and I was fascinated by that, and I think the world is still fascinated by that. That's why you find Charles James dresses in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You'll find Charles James
Well, he
collection in
masterminded that. He was the first designer
The
to
Brooklyn
put his
Museum.
stuff in the museum.
Well, he was very concerned with his legacy. And of course, I think that, you know, see, the genius of Charles James was he stood still while I stumbled through this 52 hours of film. Because somehow Charles James knew that this would come back to be something important. Charles knew that.
He was very smart, and he was
Amazing.
press unit. Yeah, he was very.
And he
much
was
ahead of
very,
his time.
very press savvy.
And he was very
Which is what
angry.
Halston was. I mean, when I look back, Halston, of course, was a genius at being a press agent, which, of course, I'm also. So there you go. Gossip
That's
columnist,
good.
press agent. Everything Charles James would hate. Sorry, Charles, but we're doing this for you. So, but really, what I learned eventually was how clever Halston was at manipulating the press, manipulating the public, at creating a brand that still exists today. And Charles couldn't do that. He wanted to.
No,
Charles
he just-
failed
but he
to create a
created-
brand even during his lifetime that generated enough money to support him. There was no perfume.
He tried.
There was no licensing.
He invented the idea.
Yes, but
Halston
he
carried
couldn't make it
through.
work. Well, to a degree, Halston failed miserably in the end as well.
Well, in a different way. But
And
what,
Halston's brand is all but disappearing as we speak.
but what Charles was also able to create was the standard of measurements that's still the standard of measurements for the human body in Washington, D.C. He was able to create designs that every person has learned from and taken from. to invent new things. He exists in the history of fashion in that way.
Oh, without question.
With these gifts
when he
that
went to
made
Paris
to design.
Chanel and Madame Grey and Balenciaga and Perich, Dior himself, all lend him his models. All were inspired by Charles James. Christian Dior said, I'm talking about really Christian Dior, not Karl Lagerfeld, not, I'm talking about Dior, said that the whole new look was inspired by a comment of Charles James. Perich said, Charles James does with scissors and cut what I do with color.
Yeah.
In the Dictionary de Snobism in France, which listed all the couturiers, Charles James was first. I mean, he was a legend in Paris.
Right.
Charles was the first British American to take the collection and show it at midnight with candlelight at the Plaza Athénée. He invented things like having two show rooms in his studio, a black room for the showing of white and summer clothes, and a white room for the showing of dark and black clothes. I mean, he very wildly clever. The eye, just amazing eye. Not just to see what others had created, but creating something himself. Charles James created silhouettes.
Oh, absolutely.
It's couturiers that create silhouettes that create history.
Well, but he also did color juxtapositions that no one had done. He also used fabrics that people had never used in a new way. He did a lot of things. He made he made the taxi dress, which God knows inspired Diane von Furstenberg and probably made her rich through her lifetime. It's the same dress, essentially.
Essentially, it's the same dress.
Yeah, he really contributed stuff of himself. And there are not many designers that you can say. I mean, there's Chanel, and there are not many others.
Madame Grey,
made beautiful clothes.
Dior, Balenciaga.
Dior,
but they're all European, most of them.
No, but what Dior did, Dior created a house that lasted, or his house lasted somehow. But his designs, his contribution to the world of design, I do not think lasted.
I'll leave that to you. You're the fashion expert.
Well, I don't know, and I have to be careful what I say, but I think Charles really left his imprimatur on. And then he had these fabulous, even though he was gay, or because he was gay, he had these fabulous relationships with women.
Bisexual, because he was married and did have and has 2 living children to this day. So
but he also, in a way, loved women.
He did love women.
He had a relationship with Millicent Rogers that was not sexual,
That's
but that was
exactly
certainly
who I was
a
trying
love
to
affair.
think of. Millicent Rogers was one of his greatest, clients.
Right, and they co-created her in a way. So there's that. There's that thing about the co-creation. There's also another fascinating subject to me, which is, and we were also talking about this last night, which is this aspect of fame. Fame for who you are as a woman, the aspect of these girls that we all know that can go out to parties every night and get themselves photographed, are involved in their own reflection. And then there are women like Pauline de Rothschild or Millicent Rogers, who are also involved in their own reflection, but because I think they have either relationships with somebody like Charles because they are the caliber to have that relationship, or because they themselves are artists of themselves. They somehow surmount that fragility, And
they could afford it because it was very expensive to be dressed by Charles James. You had to afford it in many ways, artistically, creatively, but it was expensive.
I bet. And
Charles was an expensive habit.
He was an expensive habit, and he made himself an expensive habit. He would not have liked himself to be a cheap habit.
He wasn't. Even as a friend, and I'm, 18 years old, Charles was expensive. A lot of my allowance went to dress and feed and help Charles.
Right. And everybody, everybody maintained him.
It was too bad because he had the ideas that should have allowed him to sustain himself, but the whole artistic temperament just never allowed him to complete the business side of it. He was an artist, and he suffered for his art, and he wanted to suffer for his art. and he made everyone around him suffer for his art
Uh-huh.
to some degree. But
Right.
it was still a great pleasure to know him, to be in his presence, to talk with him, to somehow collaborate with him as I did in many ways. And it was inspirational. Well, let's look at some of the Charles James artwork that I have in the room. If you go way up, you'll see one of Charles James's dresses. Why doesn't Michele Gerber Klein describe this dress?
No, it's all right. We can do
Artistically.
this. Can you hear me? Tom, no, it's just a double-breasted, tulip-skirted dress. It's very beautiful, and below that you have the croquis for the famous parka, which looks a little like a hieroglyph, and which is incredibly beautiful. And this is a perfect example. This is a drawing for a dress, but it's also a shape. It could be an abstraction, and if you go close to it, Anton, in your camera, it looks like a flower. Or it could look like, it looks very sexual too. That's like a microcosm of Charles James.
Everything that Charles
Everything
did
is so
had a sexual
multifaceted.
twist.
Right.
And what this
And
really
there's
was,
this woman
but
that
go back to the
he-
Parker. This is a white satin evening jacket.
Right.
And so it's not a dress, it's an evening jacket.
And that's
And
what
I
Diana
remember it,
Freeland refused to put in her shirt.
and I remember it well. I brought it back from somewhere, and it was really quite beautiful to look at. And the Army was inspired to create parkas from this. Below it is not a fashion drawing, because I also have the largest collection of Charles James erotica. And this one isn't that erotic. We'll get to some of those in a minute. It's a female figure, I think. Well, here's Charles James. It looks to me like an evening dress, Michelle. You're the fashion expert here.
What is this?
It's either a coat or an evening dress.
Let me see what it is. It's an evening dress. Oh, and her head is down. Now, you know what this is?
Her head is down?
Yes, this is her head with this kind of pointy shape on it. This is her back, and he morphs her around here like that. This is her hand. So
I
it's
see her
almost
foot.
like
Where's the head?
This is the head here. That's her profile. It's almost like a Beardsley in a way. There's that kind of sinuous movement going on.
Charles won a Guggenheim Fellowship for drawings as well. Now, if you go above it, I don't think I really have to tell you what that is, do I? I mean, I think that's pretty obvious.
Right.
And this is clearly not a fashion drawing. It's a very serious buttocks. But if you look at the way he draws these, you can see the shapes he uses also in his drawings of clothes. Up above is an evening dress. The back of it.
Yeah, he was very big on backs. There's this whole erotica of the back that goes on.
And to the left, I can't decide if it's a piece of jewelry or it's clearly erotic, and yet at the same time.
It looks like a Jasper.
Yeah, I mean he is. He was at an amazing. I must decide what. Shall I still give these to the Met? I haven't decided yet. Above, we've got a couple floating dresses. I put them up above because they really do look like they're floating. In the middle, you've got a man, obviously, and down a little below, you've got three little muses with little tops way down on the end there, Anton. Okay, so when you get up here, you're talking about one of the most famous dresses and the most famous drawings. This is the black and white.
That's a cloverleaf.
Yeah. This is the famous dress that Mrs. William Randolph Hearst wore to the White House.
Right.
And
for the inauguration of
President Eisenhower.
Right,
Huh?
absolutely.
And that's the one that swung on the hips like a pendulum. And if you look at the shape, the black shapes and the white shapes, if you then look back at the erotic drawings, you see these same shapes. So he's repeating his shapes and refining his shapes. Below it, of course, we don't have to describe the male anatomy. I think that's pretty clear.
And then there are these two wonderful women facing each other.
On the mantle. Next to me, the way I looked, and I was still 20 years younger, even than that, when Charles was living. But there are these two marvelous face-to-face women in these dresses. Up here, you've got two amazing Charles James evening dresses. And it's supposed to be crooked.
Okay.
It's crooked to catch
they're
your
both
eye,
crooked.
so that you kind of look at it and wonder, why is it crooked? Charles taught me to do the unexpected. But look at that red, that red evening dress. I mean, how amazing is that?
Oh, that's beautiful. It's also, it has that plat-like quality.
This is almost like the door, and I was knocking for Mr. James. Knock, knock. will Sputnik and Mr. James come out? Charles, I said. So, I think we'll do away with silence. So here's some more Charles James drawings. All these are Charles James. Evening dresses and erotica. More Charles James dresses, more Charles James. There's
Couri
Halston.
in the period.
Yeah. There's Halston, the cockroach up there. And if you look in the back, it says Portrait of Halston. Cockroach up here. And then some more Charles Jameses here in this very messy archival office. A big ball gown, more Charles Jameses. You can see, you can kind of start to figure out which are Charles and which aren't Charles. And we really need to organize this a little better. But
You really live with the echoes of the piano.
yes, I do. And when you look around, you really see him yet again. And, well,
Hi.
have we done enough for this
We've done
first
enough.
session?
We're tired.
I'm not tired.
I'm tired.
In fact, talking
He
about
wants to
Charles
go out,
James
rev you
inspires
up.
me.